Welcome back, legends. Tonight, we are going deeper than history books dare to tread. We are plunging headlong into the abyss of the unknown, an era so vast, so silent, that most people assume nothing of importance happened. They are wrong, dead wrong. This is the story of the real foundations of human existence. The terrifying moment our ancestors looked at the wild, untamed world and decided, against all natural law, that they would defy the very gods of chaos and plant a stake in the ground. Can you believe that everything you know about civilization, your towering cities, your complex laws, your massive digital networks, rests upon a hidden, nearly forgotten failure, a catastrophe no one saw coming, spanning thousands of years, where entire proto-empires rose, flourished in unimaginable complexity, and then simply vanished without a trace, leaving only stones and shadows behind. This isn't the history of pharaohs or kings. This is the history of the architects of the impossible. Before the pyramids, before Babylon, before even the simplest writing scratch on a clay tablet, there was the Great Silence. An epoch where the human spirit was forged, not in the heat of battle, but in the slow, agonizing realization that survival meant giving up the freedom of the hunt for the cruel permanence of a wall. Imagine the world 15,000 years ago. The Ice Age, that monumental shaper of continents, was dying a slow, painful death. Glaciers the size of continents were receding, roaring back into the oceans, flooding the coastlines, and triggering global chaos and seismic shifts. The climate was a drunken lunatic, swinging wildly from blistering drought to sudden, crushing cold, making life for our ancestors, the roving bands of hunter-gatherers, masters of movement, an unrelenting exercise in high-stakes survival. Their existence was pure, relentless motion, following the migrations of megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the fearsome saber-toothed cats. They had no concept of home, only territory. They were the ultimate free agents, utterly beholden to the whims of nature. And then the earth shifted, and their cherished freedom became the ultimate liability. Around 12,900 years ago, a cosmic event, perhaps a fragmented comet impact, perhaps a devastating solar shift, plunged the northern hemisphere back into an instantaneous ice age, the Younger Dryas. It was a sudden, violent freeze that lasted over 1,000 years, shattering ecosystems and wiping out the great herds that sustained the roving clans. The abundant forests withered. The reliable water sources dried up, turning fertile hunting grounds into barren, desolate wastelands. It was the ultimate ecological pressure cooker, forcing humanity to the absolute brink of annihilation. Our ancestors, those masters of adaptation, suddenly faced a stark, terrifying choice: starve and disappear like the mammoths, or change the fundamental nature of their being, defying the very ethos they had lived by for 2 million years. And that choice is the true, hidden beginning of this entire epic. They started settling, but not out of comfort. They settled in key refugia, small, isolated oases where water and wild grains still clung precariously to life. They weren't farming yet. No, that comes later. But they were stockpiling, realizing that by staying in one spot, by protecting a crucial, finite resource, they could survive the deep winter that had claimed their gods. But the truly impossible question remains: why build? Why dedicate thousands upon thousands of man-hours to constructing massive, megalithic structures of T-shaped pillars weighing 20 tons apiece, adorned with terrifying, stylized animal totems deep in the desolate mountains of what is now Turkey? This unbelievable place, Göbekli Tepe, is the smoking gun that blew up traditional history. It predates agriculture by thousands of years. It rewrites everything we thought we knew about the supposed logical progression of human advancement. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the human need for worship and community and ceremony came not after, but before the need for farming and basic survival efficiency. Think about the sheer implication of that. They were complex, organized builders before they were even settled farmers. They gathered in massive, specialized groups, hundreds of individuals, not to harvest wheat, but to worship something they couldn't possibly understand, a desperate spiritual plea against the cold silence of the dying world. This discovery proves that the transition to civilization wasn't a smooth, logical progression driven by efficiency and ease. It was a terrifying, spiritual response to environmental collapse. It was a desperate, monumental attempt to appease the angry spirits who had stolen the sun and the herds. In the next chapter, we peel back the layers of dust and silence from this impossible temple, revealing the ancient secrets of the shaman kings who engineered the first great structures of the world. Structures they would later meticulously bury under 500 cubic meters of earth, walking away as if their entire civilization was just a mistake they needed to hide forever. Get comfortable, because the story of how humanity truly began is far stranger, far darker, and infinitely more compelling than any myth you've ever heard. This is the history of the ghost cities that laid the foundation for everything, only to vanish into the dust. Stay locked in. You think the story of civilization begins with a happy farmer and a plentiful harvest. You have been lied to. The transition from the sprawling, glorious freedom of the nomadic hunter to the cramped, stressful life of the settled builder was not a triumphant march forward. It was a desperate, epoch-defining gamble against a silent, invisible enemy that almost swallowed humanity whole. This enemy had a name, whispered across the ice sheets and the suddenly barren grasslands. the younger Dryas. Imagine the world just starting to thaw out after the last great ice age, when suddenly, catastrophically, the planet slammed the brakes on warmth. We are talking about 1,300 years of global cooling that hit with the speed of a comet strike, obliterating the fragile stability that had briefly returned to the globe 12,900 years ago. Massive freshwater influxes, potentially from rapidly melting North American ice sheets, choked the crucial ocean currents, stalling the thermal conveyor belt that kept the northern hemisphere habitable. In a geological heartbeat, temperatures plummeted back down, in some regions dropping as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a single decade, destroying ecosystems that had just begun to flourish. The rain vanished, the great herds scattered or perished in the sudden killing frost. The land that had offered steady bounty for 100,000 years of human history suddenly became a hungry, unforgiving wasteland. This wasn't just a bad winter. This was the sky itself turning traitor, demanding a terrible price for the brief warmth humanity had enjoyed. This crisis is the true origin story of the Proto-Civilizations. It was not born of leisure, but of existential dread. How do you survive when the world's fundamental rules have been violently overturned? Enter the Natufians, operating in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan. These people were already living the high life right before the hammer fell. They hadn't invented agriculture yet, but they had mastered the wild harvest like no culture before them. Think of vast, naturally occurring fields of wild grains, emmer wheat and barley, so dense and plentiful that they didn't need to chase animals constantly. They were the original semi-settlers, building solid, round, semi-subterranean stone houses and carving massive storage pits into the bedrock to hoard their annual bounty. They had complex burial rituals, sophisticated ornaments made from imported shells, and a sense of shared physical permanence that their ancestors could never have dreamed of. This proto-society, flourishing around 15,000 years ago, proves that settlement can happen without farming, given the right climate conditions.
But when the younger Dryas struck, the clock ran out. The weather turned hostile almost overnight. The wild grain yields that sustained their growing populations dropped by 90%, sometimes more. Survival became a brutal, terrifying calculation.
They had two catastrophic choices. They could return to the old, desperate nomadic life, breaking apart their cherished community and abandoning their sacred burial grounds where generations of ancestors lay. Or they could double down on permanence.
They chose permanence, but they didn't choose it for the grain. They chose it for the gods. This is the horrifying pivot point of history. When the physical world fails you, when the science of hunting and gathering no longer provides enough calories to sustain life, you turn to the metaphysical. You must appease the cosmic forces that violently ripped the sun from the sky and brought the killing frost back. The first great cities were built not as logistical centers for trade or farming, but as altars intended to ward off the apocalypse.
The Natufians, desperate to maintain their spiritual connection to the land of their dead, started making their settlements smaller, tighter, and infinitely more sacred. Their homes shrank and clustered together defensively, but their communal efforts, their rituals, and shared monumental labor exploded. They didn't just build stronger walls, they built meaning. They needed places so sacred, so dedicated to the spirits, that the world could not afford to let them vanish. We see this desperation manifested in places like Dra and Ain Malaha. Massive effort poured into defense and ritual structures that defy caloric logic for a simple group of hunter-gatherers. Why would people starving and struggling to find enough calories spend weeks dragging multi-ton stones and carving elaborate burial sites? Because the spiritual economy had replaced the physical economy. Survival was now dependent on ritual performance, on demonstrating their utter commitment to the sacred ground. If they stopped building the temple, the sky would certainly fall. They were locked into an architectural arms race with the gods of the ice. They were fighting climate change with carved limestone and ancestor worship, pouring their last reserves of energy into monumental tasks that were designed to fix their souls, if not their bodies, to the earth forever. These weren't just practical silos for grain. They were massive, ritual storage pits for their collective memory and hope, carved directly into the bedrock. They were performing a geological commitment ceremony, telling the earth, "We will not leave you." This was the Natufian gamble, the first terrifying attempt to outmaneuver catastrophe by inventing formalized religion and settled society simultaneously. While many Natufian settlements fractured and faded under the relentless cold, they left behind the terrifying blueprint. This blueprint was picked up and magnified by the people who would build the first true world-altering ghost city, a location so ancient, so impossible, that its discovery 30 years ago rewrites the entire narrative of human belief. We are talking about structures built a staggering 6,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before the invention of the wheel. It is the ultimate monument to the fear spawned by the younger Dryas, a place where hunters and gatherers gathered to construct the most ambitious religious complex the world had ever seen, only to bury it forever. Next time, we plunge into the high-suspense story of Göbekli Tepe, the city built by fear, where the very concept of God was forged in the shadow of ice. We left our ancestors shivering on the edge of the abyss, the younger Dryas slamming shut the door on paradise. The world, once a generous larder bursting with migrating herds, had become a vast frozen tomb. The delicate dance of the hunter-gatherer was over, replaced by a desperate, day-to-day struggle against absolute oblivion. The sheer, crushing silence of the unending cold drove them mad. They had followed the animals for millennia, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. But now the rhythm was broken, shattered by the sudden, terrifying return of the glaciers. They needed something permanent, something to anchor their terrified souls, something that existed outside the fleeting, unreliable reality of nature. And so, in the harsh, high desert of southeast Anatolia, a decision was made that would redefine humanity forever. They were not building a town to store grain. They were building a lifeline to the divine, a desperate plea etched in stone against the face of death. This was Göbekli Tepe, the oldest megalithic structure ever discovered, and it was constructed not by farmers, but by terrified prophets. The conventional wisdom of history, repeated in textbooks for decades, insisted that civilization began with the plow. First, agriculture, then surplus, then settlement, and finally, complex religion to manage the new social structure. Göbekli Tepe screams that history got it backwards. It wasn't the need for food storage that drove permanence. It was the need for spiritual survival. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of starving, struggling hunter-gatherers, uniting not for a hunt, but for a single, massive construction project. They dragged limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons from quarries half a mile away, using only raw muscle, ropes made of woven plant fiber, and sheer, terrifying willpower. They spent years, perhaps generations, erecting these colossal, T-shaped monoliths in vast, carefully aligned circular enclosures. These weren't mere architectural features. They were stylized human figures, arms carved discreetly along the sides, wearing belts and loincloths, facing inward toward a central, unknowable point. They weren't welcoming statues. They were guards, sentinels of the invisible, standing watch over the most profound shift in human consciousness. Within these monumental rings, surrounded by walls of rough stone, the air must have crackled with spiritual intensity. The carvings tell a story of sheer, unalterated terror. Vultures, snakes, scorpions, spiders, boars, and lions. Not symbols of cute domesticity, but predators, harbingers of sickness, chaos, and violent death, carved in excruciating detail across the towering surfaces. This was a temple built for the ages, yet its message was immediate and horrifying. The wild, chaotic nature that had once sustained them was now trying to kill them, and only extreme spiritual intervention could save them. They weren't celebrating a successful harvest. They were attempting to control the terrifying forces of the cosmos that had just snatched their warm world away. The message was clear. If the physical world betrayed us, we must appeal to the metaphysical. But how did they eat? If they weren't farming, how did hundreds of people get? But how did they eat? If they weren't farming, how did hundreds of people gather in one place for months or even years to complete this monumental work? The logistical reality of Göbekli Tepe is just as revolutionary as its spiritual purpose. The answer lies in the intense, focused harvesting of wild resources. They weren't planting fields, but they were harvesting wild einkorn wheat and wild barley with ferocious efficiency. They perfected the art of resource management, not through cultivation, but through extreme hunting and gathering discipline, pushed to the brink by the necessity of feeding the construction crews. The sheer, concentrated effort required to feed the builders and the shamans led to the inadvertent first steps toward domestication, a side effect of spiritual intensity. The early seeds of agriculture were sown, not in a desire for convenience, but as a desperate catering service for the priests. This intense focus on localized resources inevitably led to territoriality and the defense of the ritual site. These were the earliest power structures, where the interpreters of the cosmic terror, the shamans and early priests, gained unimaginable control, controlling the flow of both spiritual revelation and the vital food needed to survive the ice. For centuries, Göbekli Tepe served as the epicenter of this spiritual revolution, the place where scattered hunter bands met, traded, worshipped the terrifying gods, and shared the collective burden of existence. It was a beacon of desperation, transforming fear into organization. But it could not last forever. The most astonishing, chilling secret of Göbekli Tepe is its end. After centuries of intense spiritual use, around 8200 BCE, the entire monumental complex was deliberately, systematically buried. Not destroyed by invaders, not eroded by time, but intentionally covered with dirt and refuse, entombed beneath a massive artificial hill, as if wiping the slate clean of a terrible memory. Why would they bury their most sacred site? Perhaps the spiritual practices became too dark, too demanding, consuming too much of their remaining resources. Maybe the gods they conjured were too powerful, their demands too bloody. Or perhaps the climate changed just enough that the pressure valve of spiritual necessity could finally be released. As the younger Dryas finally subsided and the world warmed, the energy required to sustain this massive cult site was redirected. The great gamble had paid off, and now they were ready for the next, equally massive gamble: agriculture. They buried their temple of fear, turning the page on a world ruled by desperation and monumental stone. The power they learned to harness, the power of organized labor and shared belief, was about to be deployed to domesticate the wild earth itself. The fear had taught them how to build a civilization. Next, we descend into the bizarre, terrifying world of the first truly settled city, Çatalhöyük,
where houses had no doors, and the dead were buried beneath the living, as humanity tried desperately to escape the very gods they had just invented.
Imagine waking up every single day, the cold earth beneath your reed mat, knowing that just inches below you, resting in an eternal curled position, is the skull of your great-grandfather. This was not a tradition of convenience. It was a spiritual iron cage. Every house in Çatalhöyük became a mausoleum, a sacred fortress built upon the bones of those who had failed to survive the Great Chill, reminding the living of the ultimate stakes of their permanence.
They had built the ultimate paradox, a city of thousands, yet every single family unit felt isolated, protected only by the weight of their dead. Their defense mechanism against the chaos outside was terrifyingly simple. Eliminate all ground-level access entirely. You didn't walk into a house, you descended into it, dropping from the rooftop walkway through a perilous ladder, the only entry, exit, and crucial source of light and smoke release. This wasn't merely ingenious defense against roaming raiders or predatory animals. It was an act of profound, controlling social engineering. The whole city was a single, massive, impenetrable, interconnected hive, literally walking over the tops of each other's lives and deaths in a terrifying horizontal movement. It mandated total, suffocating cooperation, or the entire structure, physical and social, would collapse into a single massive charnel pit.
Inside these sealed, rectangular, windowless rooms, the fear of the outside world manifested as dramatic, vibrant art. The walls, meticulously plastered and replastered hundreds of times, layer upon layer of blinding white calcium carbonate, smoothing out the imperfections of the sun-baked mud brick, became the canvas for the first truly urban nightmares. They didn't paint pictures of the bountiful harvest they were still struggling to perfect. They painted scenes of immense, terrifying power and spiritual violence. Giant murals depicted frantic mass hunts, swarms of vultures tearing at headless, contorted corpses, and the ubiquitous, menacing figure of the wild bull, the titanic aurochs. The sheer size and untamable power of the aurochs, the animal they both worshipped as a god and desperately sought to domesticate for survival, became the central icon of their existential dread. These bulls were not just sources of meat, they were the embodiment of the primal, chaotic energy of the natural world that they were trying so desperately to wall themselves off from. They took the enormous crescent-shaped horns of these magnificent beasts and ritually embedded them into the plaster benches, pillars, and clay walls of their homes, a dark form of sympathetic magic, holding the wildness captive within the domestic space, trying to appease the spirits by demonstrating power. Çatalhöyük was a sprawling metropolis of perhaps 8,000 souls at its peak, yet it was not a city of true, dedicated farmers in the sense we understand them today. They were pioneers of permanence, yes, but still deeply rooted in gathering, their diet sustained by wild pulses, nuts, and grains harvested from the nearby marshes and plains, a high-stakes logistical nightmare. This level of density, supporting thousands of mouths, required a radical specialization of labor unheard of in the small, scattered hamlets that surrounded them. Suddenly, you had individuals dedicated entirely to the dangerous, time-consuming craft of obsidian procurement, a high-risk specialization that determined the fate of the city. Obsidian, the dark, volcanic glass, sharper than modern surgical steel, was the undisputed currency of the Neolithic world, mined high in the treacherous, freezing Anatolian mountains, and then traded down the emerging, fragile corridors of this terrifying new global system. The very existence and longevity of the city depended utterly on these external trade routes, linking the settled world to the terrifyingly wild world, a chain of dependence that could be shattered by a single failed exchange or a devastating shift in the climate that they were already desperately trying to ignore. And here is the true, chilling anomaly of Çatalhöyük. For centuries, this colossal human settlement existed without any obvious signs of centralized authority, confounding every modern expectation of urban structure. No massive palace loomed over the densely packed rooftops. No single, dominant temple complex dictated doctrine like the strange pillars at Göbekli Tepe. There were no kings, no specialized, elevated class of priests, and virtually no significant difference in the size, layout, or treasured contents of the domestic houses across the entire site. Every family unit possessed roughly the same tools, the same bone burial under the floor, and the same terrifying sacred murals on their walls.
This was not a benign, ideal democracy. It was an enforced, suffocating equality, born perhaps from the shared immediate threat of the surrounding chaos and the sheer, constant need for mutual defense. They were a collective organism, held together not by a ruler's decree or a written law, but by the sheer, existential necessity of their unique architecture and the fear it contained.
What happens when 8,000 people live with such terrifying proximity, burying their dead under their own beds, yet have no single voice of authority to settle disputes or enforce compliance? The psychological pressure must have been immense, a constant, low-frequency hum of potential violence and breakdown, managed only by strict, unwritten, life-or-death ritual and the shared obsession with the safety of their roof-based world. They had solved the immediate problem of survival by creating a social pressure cooker, trading the freedom of the nomadic hunt for the terrifying stability of the dense, bone-filled hive. The ultimate question was, how long could the lid stay on this societal time bomb before the internal pressures of the first great city led to its explosive, inevitable demise? The answer was already being written in the crumbling, replastered walls, waiting for the gods to finally reclaim their lost children. The air turned thin, not with oxygen loss, but with the suffocating realization of absolute failure. The first great experiment in permanence had collapsed, a hollowed-out skull of mud and bone, demonstrating to the survivors a terrifying, undeniable truth. The earth itself no longer wanted them. Nomadic life, once the pinnacle of human freedom and adaptability, was now a guaranteed death sentence, forcing the scattered bands of humanity into a corner from which there was no natural escape. The familiar, generous world of the Pleistocene, the age of megafauna and predictable bounty, was dead. In its place roared the younger Dryas, a cataclysmic, thousand-year spasm of global cooling that snapped the planet back into a terrifying ice age, just as humanity believed it was finally mastering its destiny. Temperatures plummeted. The great rivers froze into sluggish arteries of ice, and the vast, teeming grasslands recoiled into barren, wind-scoured scrubland, creating an environment of perpetual, gnawing scarcity and dread. This was not a localized drought. This was cosmic betrayal. The rhythmic, cyclical time that governed hunter-gatherers, the guaranteed return of the herds, the predictable bloom of the seasons, shattered into unpredictable chaos. The spiritual guardians of the tribes, the shamans and the elder storytellers, watched their power wither. Their ancient dances to summon the rain failed consistently. Their prayers to guide the bison proved utterly useless because the bison were simply gone, swallowed by the cold. If the natural world was broken beyond repair, if the traditional spirits were deaf or worse, dead, humanity had only one desperate, illogical option left: to seize control of the divine connection themselves. They had to build a new world, a new heaven, by sheer collective force of will, anchoring their chaotic existence to immense stone that defied the flux of the dying world. This was the frightening, necessary birth of true monumentalism. They built not to store grain, they barely had any surplus, but to store meaning and stability. They needed structures so vast, so geometrically demanding, so powerfully constructed that the heavens could not possibly ignore them. A physical, undeniable plea for salvation, written in megalithic script across the starving landscape. Enter the high, desolate plains of southeastern Anatolia, the belly of the beast where the climate catastrophe struck hardest, driving fragmented human groups to the literal breaking point. Here, on a high, wind-scoured hilltop, sometime around 11,500 years ago, they began to carve their desperate answer into the bedrock itself. This was not a village, not a city, but the first cathedral, a terrifying, silent agreement between desperation and divinity. They called it Göbekli Tepe. They dragged stones weighing 10, 20, even 50 tons, stones larger than any their nomadic ancestors had ever considered moving, not to build defensive walls, but to construct vast, perfectly circular enclosures, open entirely to the unforgiving, empty sky. Think about the sheer, non-economic, illogical effort involved. These were hunter-gatherers, people perpetually on the edge of starvation, pouring every ounce of their collective caloric energy into building something they would never, ever live in. Why? Because the massive T-shaped pillars, stylized human forms without faces or defined features, were not decoration. They were the silent sentinels, the direct intermediaries, watching the chaotic,
dying world, their surfaces carved obsessively with a menagerie of predatory animals, snakes writhing in thick knots, scorpions poised to strike, massive vultures and venomous spiders.
This was not a celebration of life or fertility. It was a carved pantheon of pure, existential terror, reflecting the brutal reality of the environment that had betrayed them. The animals chosen for depiction were the apex predators, the symbols of death and chaos, suggesting a ritualistic attempt to appease or perhaps control the very forces that were driving them toward extinction. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men and women, often from disparate rival tribes, momentarily unified and fueled entirely by fear and religious fervor, hauling these prehistoric giants up the slope, their bare hands chafing raw against the rough limestone. Every muscle strain, every drop of sweat, every cracked stone was a prayer, a physical act of demanding stability from a universe that had offered only relentless, unforgiving flux. The exhaustion itself was the sacrifice. The sheer scale of non-subsistence investment into these stone circles reveals the deep, paralyzing spiritual trauma inflicted by the younger Trias. They were building a massive, intertribal panic room for the soul, a place where rival groups could temporarily forget their differences and unite under the crushing weight of existential dread, driven by a shared, terrifying belief that the world was ending and required massive human intervention. This absolute need for communal, monumental ritual space became the true, unavoidable precursor to settled life. Before we ever settled down to grow wheat for sustained consumption, we were forced to settle down to worship, to beg the universe for forgiveness for some unnamed transgression. The transgression perhaps being the mere act of existing in such a hostile, unforgiving age. And then comes the ultimate, chilling final act of each completed enclosure. After centuries of intense, demanding use, after the rituals had been performed, and the cosmological map had been temporarily stabilized through immense effort, the builders did not simply abandon the site and walk away. They didn't let the weather or time erode their sacred work. They deliberately, systematically buried it. They took millions of cubic feet of earth and rubble and intentionally entombed the giant T-pillars, sealing the circles beneath massive, man-made mounds, thereby creating the very hill we see today, sealing their monumental efforts away from the gaze of the heavens. It was a massive, collective act of historical and theological erasure, a burial ceremony for an entire era of intense, desperate human faith. Was it profound fear that drove them to bury their gods, hiding the evidence of their hubris? Did the ritual succeed so completely that the structures were rendered obsolete, the sacred energy contained and sealed away? Or did the rituals fail so spectacularly that the people needed to hide the proof of their arrogance from the jealous, unforgiving celestial powers?
We may never know the exact motive for this extraordinary mass entombment, but the message is chillingly clear. The most sacred places, the very anchors of their new existence, were meant to be temporary, sealed capsules of intense spiritual energy, ready to be unearthed or perhaps rebuilt by the next generation, only when the world inevitably began to fail again, plunging humanity into the next great, terrifying gamble.
The world did fail. It wasn't a slow, gentle transition. It was a sudden, bone-chilling betrayal by the climate itself, roughly 12,900 years ago, forcing humanity into the next great, terrifying gamble. Imagine the slow, predictable rhythms of the Pleistocene melting, the gentle warmth that signaled abundance, suddenly replaced by an Arctic nightmare that swept across the continents with the speed of a prehistoric predator. The Ice Age wasn't over. It had merely retreated briefly, and now it had returned for an encore. And this time, it was deeply, violently personal. The Younger Dryas Impact Event, or whatever planetary mechanism triggered this catastrophic reversal, slammed the global thermostat back down, plunging vast swaths of the northern hemisphere into a brutal 1,300-year deep freeze. The megafauna, the colossal beasts that had sustained humanity for millennia, began to falter and vanish. Their ancient migration paths were derailed, their crucial grazing grounds locked solid beneath meters of unexpected permafrost. This was the moment the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the only way of life humanity had ever known, ceased being a sustainable existence and quickly became a death sentence. The nomadic bands, once the proud, adaptable masters of the terrain, were instantly reduced to desperate, freezing refugees, chasing vanishing herds and huddling in increasingly resource-starved caves. They watched the skies turn a permanent, hostile gray, and the snows piled higher than the memories of their oldest ancestors could account for. This cataclysmic reversal didn't just change the weather. It fundamentally shattered the Neolithic mind, producing a cosmic confusion that went far deeper than mere hunger. The core problem was not just the physical starvation, but the profound spiritual crisis that accompanied it. For thousands upon thousands of years, the spiritual contract with the world had been beautifully simple and elegant. Follow the path, respect the spirits of the hunt, and the earth would inevitably provide. When the earth suddenly stopped providing, when the life-giving warmth was replaced by the icy, unforgiving grasp of death, the only logical conclusion was terror. These intensely spiritual people believed the gods were actively punishing them, or worse, had abandoned them entirely. This wasn't just a prolonged weather event. It was a crisis of faith on a planetary scale, a desperate, freezing search for meaning when the entire structure of reality, their very cosmos, had begun to crumble into icy dust. If the world was actively trying to dissolve them, how could they convince the spirits of their worthiness? The old ways, the fluid, temporary camps, the light structures, the constant, shifting movement, suddenly felt disrespectful, transient, and utterly unworthy of the cosmic forces they were desperately trying to appease. They needed permanence, not for the eventual farming that would come 2,000 years later, but for sanctuary and spiritual anchoring. They needed to build something so solid, so heavy, and so enduring that the enraged deities, looking down upon the frozen chaos, would be forced to take notice of humanity's profound and sacrificial commitment.
This is the true, terrifying origin story of the Proto-Civilization. It was a desperate, high-stakes Hail Mary pass against geological time, a sacrificial offering of their former freedom, driven by existential panic. The gamble was terrifying. Abandon the mobility that kept them alive, and instead invest every ounce of their dwindling energy into becoming rooted, immovable beacons of devotion. If the climate didn't stabilize, they would simply starve in place, unable to follow the few remaining animals. But the reward, the burning hope, was a return to cosmic stability, the appeasement of the earth spirits, demanding an eternal, stationary monument to human fear and devotion.
We often look at the earliest permanent settlements, the ancestors of places like Jericho or the dense complexity of Çatalhöyük, and see clever early town planning. But the terrifying truth is that they were spiritual lifeboats, built entirely in the shadow of complete, irreversible annihilation. They were architectural prayers etched into the barren landscape, massive energy sinks designed to anchor the very soul of humanity to a rapidly spinning, unstable planet. These structures weren't just better shelters, they were unbreakable commitments. Think about the immense, back-breaking labor involved in building a durable, multi-room permanent structure when your entire philosophical tradition dictated minimalism and relentless movement. Every heavy stone laid was a direct rejection of 10,000 years of tradition.
It was a terrifying, irrevocable leap into the unknown, demanding entirely new social technologies. You couldn't just pick up and leave a giant structure when disputes arose, so conflicts had to be solved, resources had to be strictly managed, and collective memory had to be formalized into shared, permanent narratives. The social fabric began to stretch and warp under the extreme pressure of forced proximity and immovable residence. Most significantly, the spiritual intensity amplified exponentially under the weight of these permanent structures. If the nomadic shrine was a temporary altar, the settled structure became a permanent, pulsating nexus of ritual power, a literal machine for divine communication. The dead were often buried directly beneath the house floors, literally cementing the past into the present. This ensured that the ancestors couldn't float away or be forgotten, chaining the family irrevocably to the fixed location, making the commitment absolute. It was a psychological trap, a cage built of stone and bone, yet one that was absolutely necessary. They chained themselves to the land with their architecture and their dead, hoping that this ultimate surrender to permanence would somehow force the volatile climate back into submission. This desperate, fearful choice, made under the shadow of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, is the true foundation upon which all future cities, empires, and technologies would eventually stand. Built not on prosperity or convenience,
but on the profound terror of existential scarcity and the ultimate spiritual need to stop the world from ending. The terrifying realization that the sky was actively trying to kill them forced a collective neurological short circuit in the human mind. Every instinct, honed over millennia, to move, to follow the herds, to remain unbound by fixed geography, had to be violently overridden by a desperate, catastrophic faith. They had to stop the world from ending. And the only known way to stop a spiritual catastrophe was through monumental, permanent, and terrifyingly complex ritual acts. The wandering peoples, the eternal hunters, who had mastered the delicate balance of impermanence, now committed the ultimate blasphemy against their own ancestral spirit. They rooted themselves, not in the low, convenient floodplains, but on the highest, most exposed hilltops, places where the wind still screamed the cold truth of the younger Dryas. They chose the stone. They chose the mountain. For centuries, millennia even, the concept of a structure that could not be taken down, packed up, and moved within a single day was an absurd, debilitating weakness. Now, permanence was the ultimate strength, the heavy anchor they hoped would moor their entire existence against the savage currents of a broken climate. Imagine the scene, the relentless, back-breaking labor demanded by a spiritual necessity so profound it overrode the instinct for survival itself. We are not talking about piling up river stones. We are talking about the deliberate quarrying and transport of massive limestone megaliths, pillars weighing upwards of 10 to 20 metric tons. These stones were not found conveniently near the building site. They had to be carefully fractured from distant bedrock, shaped using brute percussion, and then dragged for kilometers across unforgiving terrain, using only raw human muscle, ropes of twisted hide, and the terrifying momentum of collective despair. This level of sustained, coordinated physical exertion was utterly unprecedented in the history of Homo sapiens. It implied a logistical nightmare that dwarfed the effort required for simple subsistence. Who was organizing this impossible effort? Who was feeding the workers? The answer lies in the silent, terrifying birth of hierarchy. Before this moment, leadership was temporary, based on hunting prowess or wisdom around the fire. Now, a new class emerged, born from the very terror that gripped society. The master ritualists, the early proto-priests. These individuals, the shamans who had diagnosed the cosmic sickness and prescribed the monumental cure, were suddenly transformed from spiritual guides into the original logistical commanders. They became the first true managers, the CEOs of the Stone Age, directing vast, fluctuating labor pools, not through military might, for armies were still millennia away, but through the absolute, unchallengeable mandate of divine necessity. Their power was not derived from wealth, which barely existed, but from their exclusive access to the terrifying knowledge of how to appease the cosmic forces. They were the intermediaries between the suffering human world
and the indifferent, murderous gods of the Ice Age. To sustain this labor force, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people congregating for short bursts of intensive construction required a revolution in resource allocation. This was the invention of the ceremonial feast economy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe screams this truth. Massive stone troughs and vessels designed not for daily cooking, but for the communal brewing of unimaginable quantities of wild grain beer, and fire pits large enough to roast entire herds of wild cattle, aurochs. People didn't settle down to farm crops. They gathered together to construct temples, and the temples demanded that they throw parties large enough to motivate the immense physical sacrifice required. The construction effort preceded the need for permanent settlement, creating the engine that would eventually demand agriculture. Every ton of stone moved, every engraved symbol carved into the T-pillars, depicting snarling predators and abstract symbolic narratives, was a prayer solidified. It was an attempt to encode the chaotic, deadly reality of their environment into an unmoving, sacred structure that would last forever, even if the people who built it did not. But this solution, this monumental gamble on permanence, introduced a crushing, unseen cost to the human psyche and the social fabric. They had found a terrifying answer to the existential crisis of the spirit, but in doing so, they had sacrificed the two things that had defined human freedom since the dawn of time: total autonomy and equality. The moment someone had to tell 500 others where and when to pull the rope, the nomadic, egalitarian dream died. The collective terror had manufactured the first true class division, creating those who directed the ritual and those whose sole duty was to provide the brutal, unending labor for its construction. The world was slowly warming, slowly, agonizingly retreating from the younger Dryas. But humanity was now shackled to the very monuments built out of fear of the cold. The stone temples stood tall, magnificent, and utterly immovable. And beneath their heavy shadow, the ancient, restless spirit of the hunter was finally, tragically, falling asleep. The spirit was sleeping, yes, but the body was wide awake and sweating under an unimaginable, grinding burden. For the first time in the entire history of the human lineage, 200,000 years of glorious wandering, humanity was lifting weight it knew it could not easily put down. They were no longer following the easy migration routes. They were aggressively commanding the very bedrock of the landscape, moving megaliths that often weighed more than 20 fully grown elephants, carving dense limestone with tools that should have shattered instantly from the stress of the labor. This was not a simple transition, not a leisurely hobby undertaken by well-fed people in a stable climate. This was a panicked, collective, existential cry against the chaos of the Great Freeze, a desperate attempt to build a physical connection to the divine before the icy darkness consumed them all. every single heavy T-pillar standing sentinel at the holy sites like Göbekli Tepe, every imposing stone circle at Nivali Chori represented 1,000 days of lost freedom, traded for one horrifying night of guaranteed spiritual security. The cost of this permanence was astronomical, not just in caloric expenditure, but in social contract. Who exactly convinced the great hunters, the proud, independent wanderers whose entire identity was tied to motion and pursuit, to chain themselves to a single patch of sacred dirt? It required the terrifying rise of a specialized spiritual elite. The shaman, the priest king, the dark visionary who claimed direct, non-negotiable communication with the terrible, vengeful gods of the younger Dryas. These rising figures were the engineers of permanence, the psychological manipulators who understood that only monumental, shared terror could forge a social structure strong enough to defy the climate apocalypse. The community had to completely reorganize its economy overnight to feed the builders, clothe the carvers, house the new management class, and elevate the storytellers who justified the grueling, non-stop labor schedule and the loss of individual autonomy. The old, fluid equality of the Paleolithic nomadic band, where status was temporary and based on immediate contribution to the hunt, dissolved rapidly under the heavy shadow of the temple walls. Suddenly, permanent specialization was the only way to survive the commitment they had made. The physically strongest became the permanent movers of stone. The cleverest became the record keepers and managers, though using memory and ritual, not yet true writing. And the most rhetorically gifted became the undisputed, powerful spiritual elite, demanding tribute and labor. The social pressure cooker was immense, and it was reflected in the very architecture they were constructing. Look closely at those iconic, menacing T-pillars. They are not decorated with scenes of successful harvests or happy community gatherings. They are plastered with grotesque, aggressive images of scorpions, highly venomous snakes, massive diving vultures, and stalking predatory leopards. Images of pure, lethal chaos. These were not merely decorative motifs. They were deep, resonant warnings, powerful spiritual talismans designed to ward off the primordial, hungry threat lurking just beyond the temple wall. The very chaos the towering structures were built to contain. The entire Göbekli Tepe enterprise was a massive, ongoing act of collective trauma bonding, a horrifying agreement hammered out under cosmic duress. Living free was simply too unpredictable, too dangerous, when the chaotic world itself was actively trying to freeze and starve you to death. The sheer, relentless energy required to maintain this complex, centralized system was staggering, far beyond the physical strain of merely lifting the stones. It was the continuous mental reorganization, the enforced discipline, the need to trust your neighbor implicitly, not just with your life on the hunt, but with your future and the success of the meager, sacred wild grain they were now cultivating in desperation. The temples demanded a state of permanence, but permanence, in turn, demanded constant, reliable, localized sustenance. This is the exact moment, this desperate, freezing period between 10,000 and 9,000 BCE, when humanity was forced by its own immense spiritual commitment to look down at the wild grasses and ask the most pivotal, terrifying question in all of history. Can we fundamentally control your reproductive cycle? This was not the gentle, gradual discovery of farming that romantic historians often portray. This was triage farming, the rapid, forced domestication of wild wheat and barley, specifically the extremely hardy einkorn, under immense environmental duress. They were not seeking luxurious abundance. They were desperately seeking absolute predictability to feed the armies of builders and priests supporting the immense ritual site. The stakes were astronomically high. If the ritual failed, if the massive structure collapsed due to poor engineering, or if the meager, newly controlled harvest spoiled, the entire settlement would starve quickly and violently, having already sacrificed the precious mobility needed to escape and find food elsewhere. They had deliberately, definitively, burned the bridge back to the fluid, safe, nomadic lifestyle. They were locked into their decision. The sheer weight of this overwhelming new responsibility settled upon the proto-civilization like the massive, heavy capstones of their sacred enclosures. This proto-civilization was birthed not from the luxury of comfort or excess resources, but from debilitating terror and immense, non-negotiable obligation. The priest class grew exponentially richer in influence. The workers grew stronger in their rigid muscle, but the soul of the collective grew increasingly confined and trapped. They had simply exchanged the wide-open, immediate, unpredictable terror of the roaming ice age for the tight, rigid, predictable terror of localized social collapse and forced labor. They were now utterly trapped, held hostage by their own magnificent, heavy architecture. And as the rituals grew ever more intense and demanding, designed to appease a cold, silent, unforgiving sky that had violently stolen the warmth, the people began to realize the terrible, tragic irony of their existence. They had meticulously built the temples to escape the external cold of the younger Dryas, but the real cold, the relentless, demanding, soul-crushing discipline of mandatory civilization, was now growing deep within their very bones. They were permanent, they were magnificent, and they were utterly, terrifyingly, inextricably stuck. The terrible silence descended upon the fixed settlements, not with a bang, but with the slow, crushing weight of realization. They had achieved permanence, yes, but permanence was not a reward. It was a life sentence. Every single dawn, the 500 souls clustered behind the new, rough-hewn palisades knew they could not just walk away. Even if the spring hunt failed, even if the fever came sweeping through the closely packed living spaces, even if the shaman's predictions turned to dust. They were anchors, digging into the earth, and the earth demanded a terrible price for this stability. That price was absolute, uncompromising specialization, a division of labor so rigid it began to cut away at the very notion of shared communal freedom that had defined 200,000 years of human existence. The age of the universal hunter-gatherer, the person who knew everything required for survival, was violently over. Now, they needed specialists. They needed people whose hands never touched a spear, whose eyes never scanned the horizon for game, but whose entire existence was dedicated to maintaining the terrifying complexity of the settled machine. The population density alone was a nightmare their ancestors could not have conceived. Where once a large family group might have briefly camped, now 500 people lived, breathed, ate, and disposed of waste all year round, generating a constant, simmering crisis of sanitation and resource depletion. The old ways of leaving the refuse behind and moving on were now lethal. Someone had to manage the refuse pits, digging deeper and further away, defining the very boundaries of the settlement's territorial filth. Someone had to manage the water, the single most precious resource, which was now under imaginable strain. The local spring, once a generous gift, was now a lifeline that could be severed by a dry season, or worse, by a rival group recognizing its strategic importance. This necessity birthed the first proto-engineers, the masters of hydrology. These were not shamans or hunters. They were quiet, calculating men and women obsessed with stone-lined cisterns, rudimentary canals, and ensuring every drop of rain was captured and hoarded. Their decisions dictated life and death in a way no hunt ever could. The power dynamic shifted instantly. The strongest hunter still commanded respect, but the person who controlled the water supply, who knew how to build the wall that kept the water in and the enemy out, wielded true infrastructural power. This was the silent, terrifying genesis of the ruling class, not based on brute strength, but on technical, indispensable knowledge. Simultaneously, the psychic pressure of living cheek by jowl, year after year, with the same neighbors, the same grudges, and the same anxieties, required an explosion of ritual complexity. The gods, it seemed, were furious that humanity had stopped moving, that they had dared to chain themselves to one patch of dirt. The proto-priests became the new spiritual police, their role evolving far beyond seasonal appeasement. They were now full-time managers of collective dread, orchestrating massive, complex, energy-draining ceremonies designed to keep the entire community psychologically cohesive and focused on the shared monumental task of survival. Look at the evidence. The early ceremonial sites like Göbekli Tepe, monuments of astronomical effort built by communities that, by definition, did not have agricultural surplus to spare. Why? Because the ritual was the surplus. The ritual was the social glue that prevented the trapped, exhausted inhabitants from turning on each other in a frenzy of claustrophobic despair.
Every heavy stone they lifted, every repetitive chant they uttered, was a mechanism of control, a physical manifestation of the shared, terrifying commitment to staying right where they were. The effort of building the massive T-pillars was a mandatory, non-negotiable tax on their time, distracting them from the crushing burden of their fixed existence.
This constant, grinding effort also introduced the ultimate specialization, the warrior caste. Permanence was an open invitation for predation. The settled groups were predictable. Their grain stores, even if only wild einkorn, were concentrated. And they were heavy with possessions, things the still free nomads coveted. The very walls they built, whether the immense circular structures of Jericho or the tightly packed, doorless homes of Çatalhöyük, were monuments to fear. They were fortresses, not just homes, signaling to the world that these people had something worth stealing, and, crucially, that they were willing to die defending their immovable wealth. The warrior was no longer just a good hunter who could fight when necessary. They became a dedicated specialist, divorced from the daily rhythm of gathering, focusing solely on defense and the ruthless maintenance of the perimeter. This required strict hierarchy, mandatory military service, and the grim recognition that their freedom was now contingent on the professional violence of a few. The Proto-Civilization was thus born from necessity, forged in the twin fires of environmental collapse and spiritual anxiety. It was a machine of relentless work, requiring the systematic elimination of individual freedom for the sake of collective, terrifying survival. The terrifying question remained: could this fragile, specialized structure hold together when the very memory of freedom was still fresh in the minds of the old? The gamble was cast, the dice were rolling, and the weight of 1,000 generations of future human history now rested on the weary shoulders of these utterly, terrifyingly, inextricably trapped people, praying to the newly invented, furiously demanding gods of permanence.